the people of Gaza and the resistance, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the others, they were fighting for their survival. But Hezbollah willingly sacrificed their uh, members, their soldiers, their leaders to protect the people of Gaza, to draw away much of the Israeli regime forces. And in fact, during the 2 months of very heavy fighting between the regime and Hezbollah, that fighting, as I said earlier, was the most intense, not of just this war, but of all the wars that the regime has fought in its history. And Hezbollah held its ground. I've been saying that the Israeli regime will fail in Gaza and in Lebanon and in the Red Sea from the very beginning. The Israelis were bound to be defeated in Gaza, despite the horrific massacres and the genocide, the Holocaust. The Palestinians were determined from day one that they will hold their ground. And Hamas and its allies showed the Israelis that they are not the power that they were before. In the decades before the rise of the axis of resistance, whenever the Israelis wanted to invade a neighboring country, whether Lebanon or Syria or Jordan or Egypt, they would advance swiftly and take large amounts of land. They went all the way to Beirut, they took the West Bank, they took the Golan, and of course they went all the way across the Sinai very easily and very swiftly. So I think this has been a major defeat for Israel. The last 16 months, been almost 16 months now, have been disastrous. And the most important element of all is that the regime has been delegitimized in the eyes of the global majority. Even in the West, even in the United States, you see people like Tucker Carlson saying things that were not said before. Candace Owens, these are people on the right, and among other groups in American civil society, we see huge opposition towards Zionism and the regime itself. And therefore, I think that is the most devastating aspect of this conflict, the fact that they have not just the Israeli regime, but the collective West. It has destroyed its image across the world because they've been partner to this genocide. The only thing that was unexpected was Syria, and Syria, as I said from the very beginning, was a tactical victory for Netanyahu, Erdogan, and Biden. But I think in the long run, actually, Syria is not going to end well for any of these actors, because Al Qaeda in Syria is not going to be able to control the country. We're already seeing it's the slaughter of people who they feel are a threat. We see that they're incapable of governing, and we also see that countries across the region and across Asia are wary, very wary of Al Qaeda. Countries that like China, Russia, Central Asian countries where many of these fighters come from, they're concerned, and they're concerned about what Mr. Erdogan is doing. And even countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan are concerned. Jolani is trying to strengthen relations with the Saudis, but the Saudis are worried because these extremists in Syria have ambitions that go beyond the borders of Syria, and many of them are far more extreme than Jolani, or at least today, Jolani today. Otherwise, Jolani was the deputy of ISIS. He was Abu Baghdadi's deputy. He killed thousands of people in car bombs across Iraq. But the Jolani today, he is going to have a very tough time dealing with the more extreme elements that have taken Damascus. And that, as I said, is a threat to the West, because the countries that are threatened by these extremist groups are in the Western camp. But this time around in Gaza, they were stuck. And in Lebanon, we saw the most heavy fighting ever between the Israeli regime and a power outside of its borders. The battle in southern Lebanon on the border was very heavy. The fighting was extraordinarily heavy, but Hezbollah held its ground, and the Israeli regime was unable to take a single city, even a small city or a large town. It failed completely. And while many were martyred in Gaza and in Lebanon, and civilians were slaughtered, and resistance fighters on both to the south and the north were martyred, but the Israelis failed. And we also saw in the Red Sea for over 15 months, the Americans tried to crush the resistance there too, so that the Israelis could use the Red Sea to strengthen their economy, to carry out the genocide more easily. They failed. They failed across the board. This was all expected. So I think Iran is in a position, it's being very smart. They have the capability, and that itself is deterrence. It's a threshold state. But they don't want the bomb. And as I said, if they wanted it, they would have had it a long time ago. And there's nothing that the Americans could have done about it. And there's nothing they can do about it today. And that, I think, the smartest thing is to do one's best to prevent nuclear war, because that would bring about the end of humanity. If there's a nuclear exchange anywhere in this world, that will have huge consequences. And of course, if it's between the Americans and the Chinese and the Russians, that would bring an end to everything. But a nuclear war, whether between India and Pakistan or or in our region, that will have consequences for the entire globe that will be irreversible. That this is the last war, unfortunately. And I think that more people will sadly die because of the Western insistence to impose racism on the people of our region. The West insists on supporting ethno-supremacism. They insist on ethnic cleansing, and they insist on genocide and slaughter. That's what Western regimes have been doing in Palestine for a very long time, and they've intensified it more recently. But this will not end well for them. I think this is the beginning of the end of the Israeli regime. I think that significant numbers will, a significant number has already left, and more will leave in future, because the regime will no longer it will no longer thrive. No major business would be stupid enough to invest in Palestine anymore, because they know that if something happens, all of those investments can just disappear. And therefore, I I don't see this lasting much longer. I'm not saying that the regime will collapse next month or next year, but I think we are witnessing the beginning of the end. And as you point out, history is not a matter of days and weeks. Things can play out very slowly, but for us at least. But for a historian who looks back in history, these are very brief moments. But in any case, I'm confident that ultimately apartheid in Palestine will be defeated, and we already see that there has been a sea change across the world. Most people across the world seem to be ignorant about Palestine. They just saw Israel as a country and the Palestinian issue as a small conflict between two people over land. Over the past 15, 16 months, people have been learning about history. They've learned about the Nikba. They've been seeing the nature of Zionism, what Zionism actually means, and the racism and the evil that lies behind it. And even in the United States, you've seen, as I said earlier, a sea change among public opinion and among and people of influence. I think actually we are seeing the rise of new forces in Syria. And I think that's good for Syria, because the Ba'athist party of Assad obviously was very corrupt. And while the axis of resistance defended the Syrian government, they were defending it against something that was much worse, and that was ISIS and Al Qaeda, against the very same people who have taken over the country today. Otherwise, it's not as if the previous government was a government that was ideal for the Syrian people. But we do see this. We also saw an attack on Israeli regime positions in Syria, by a resistance organization. So we're seeing things begin to happen in Syria, and also, it's not just the withdrawal of the Israelis. We saw the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians move to the north, and then we saw people power in Lebanon move to the south, and because at the end of the ceasefire, where the Israeli regime was supposed to withdraw, as expected, they didn't, and so the Lebanese mobilized supporters of the resistance, Christian, Muslim, Shia, Sunni, Druze, people who supported the resistance from all over Lebanon went to the south and went to their villages. And the Israeli regime was so disgusting that they gunned down ordinary people, including 6 women. So it was, in a sense, it was a revolution or people power led by women of the resistance. So, these I think were 2 powerful blows to the regime. So it is understandable for these Israeli soldiers to weep and cry because they've invested so much in this genocide, and ultimately they've been forced to pull out. That doesn't mean the war is over, because it is quite possible that the ceasefire will collapse. We have to see what Netanyahu does. We'll have to see where Trump takes this. But if the ceasefire moves forward, it is a catastrophic defeat for the regime. And if they continue with the genocide, I think the defeat will be even more catastrophic, because the world is now witnessing these soldiers being released. The images are very bad for Israel. Seeing these women soldiers well fed, all of the Israelis well fed, well taken care of. It again rips apart the narrative of the West and the Israeli regime, Western media, Western governments, Western think tanks, Western journalists. Their narrative has been ripped apart, and then of course they don't show the thousands of Palestinians who are being released, the women and the children, many of them who were just taken hostage and never charged. But we see how many of them were battered, how many of them have broken teeth, and many of them are suffering from malnutrition. This has been catastrophic for the regime. And if the genocide resumes, I think the world will be much more angry than even it has been over the past few months. And without a doubt, the Israelis would like to see a war. They would be more than willing to sacrifice the United States or the Europeans or the global economy for their own selfish interests. They never cared about the West. They've destroyed the image and the credibility of the West by carrying out this Holocaust for the last 15, 16 months. The West has paid the price in the sense that they have no credibility across the world. The world sees the West as barbaric and inhumane, the Western elites and the regimes that are in power. So Israel, is more than willing to sacrifice everything. So I think Iran is in a position. It's being very smart. They have the capability, and that itself is deterrence. It's a threshold state. But they don't want the bomb. And as I said, if they wanted it, they would have had it a long time ago. And there's nothing that the Americans could have done about it. And there's nothing they can do about it today. And that, I think, the smartest thing is to do one's best to prevent nuclear war, because that would bring about the end of humanity. If there's a nuclear exchange anywhere in this world, that will have huge consequences. And of course, if it's between the Americans and the Chinese and the Russians, that would bring an end to everything. But a nuclear war, whether between India and Pakistan or in our region, that will have consequences for the entire globe that will be irreversible. Well, we have to remember that just a few weeks ago, Western media and Western think tanks day and night were saying that Iran is severely weakened and that the axis of resistance has fallen apart. But right after that, and we've had this discussion before, and I said this is not true. And right after that, we saw the victory in Gaza. We saw people in Lebanon push out the Israeli regime. We see Yemen steadfast. And we see that Syria is not turning out so well for those who support Al Qaeda, and a burden has been lifted off the shoulders of the Iranians. Iran has been giving Syria free oil and helping it alongside the Russians and the Iraqis, and I think the Algerians. Well, now uh, those countries that have helped destroy Syria, and they have destroyed Syria. Mr. Erdogan will be remembered in history as someone who murdered hundreds of thousands of Syrians in his dirty war. And so will Qatar, and so will all those countries that funded Al Qaeda and ISIS and the others, and the Israeli regime and the Europeans and the Jordanian regime. They'll all be remembered for doing this. What Tulsi Gabbard said is just the beginning of this exposure. It will come out more in future, and these people will be remembered for what they did. But in any case, the burden is on their shoulders now. Now they're the ones who are going to have to pay for Syria, and it's going to be much more costly than before because the country is in utter chaos, because the bureaucracy has fallen apart, because the infrastructure has been destroyed and the Israelis have been bombing it and destroying it and taking key parts of the country. And because Al Qaeda has just made people angry, and we see people rising up in different parts of the country. So these countries are going to have to, this is going to be a huge burden for them. And I don't think they're going to be successful. So I think that the axis of resistance today is very strong, and it will grow stronger. And the Israeli regime and the West, as they continue, the West as it continues to confront the Russians, and the United States has foolishly, under Trump, refrained from taking the right steps to end the war in Ukraine. They are, it's as we expected, though. I didn't think that Trump would move swiftly to end this horrible war. So the people of Ukraine are going to continue to pay the price, but this is going to be a burden for the West. Every day that this war continues, it's a heavy cost for the West. Just like, remember, after the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, after the occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq, they were saying that the United States has wasted $6 or $7 trillion. I think in 2017, 16, Trump himself said that. So one of your viewers can look this up and correct me about the date. The war in Ukraine is much more costly. It's not just a direct cost, because people talk about how much the United States has sent to Ukraine or how much the Europeans. That's just a fraction of the cost. The refugees, the end of Russian cheap gas and cheap energy, the lack of trade between West. These are trillions of dollars of damage. These have brought trillions of dollars of damage brought about, and it will only continue to get worse. So I don't think that the regime will last very long. And the fact is that the United States and the Europeans that have been the real reason why the regime exists, they are on the decline, on the relative decline. Europe is declining much faster than the United States. And the rest of the world, which is very much outraged by these atrocities, they're on the rise. So the Israeli regime, as we've seen over the past 16 months, is completely dependent on the United States and the West. It's not an independent regime. The West has to send weapons 24 hours a day to help it slaughter women and children. Yet it still was unable to win. So the regime has declined. The West is in decline, relative decline. This is not going to end well. And also our regime, our region has regimes that are in the Western camp that are very vulnerable. People in this region see forget, Iran and the axis of resistance aside, people across the region know that their governments have done nothing but help the Israeli regime. Even those who pretend to be pro-Palestinian, like Erdogan, who every now and then makes a speech or has a demonstration, holds a demonstration against Israel, he's doing all sorts. He's fueling the genocide. It's the oil that he sends to Israel that helps with it. Even after Netanyahu was declared a war criminal and an arrest warrant was given, he continued to do business with it. So it gave large numbers of martyrs among civilians and among supporters of the resistance and among the resistance itself for the sake of another people, for the sake of the people of Palestine, for the people of Gaza in particular. And in addition to that, Ansarullah, they did the same. They made sacrifices. They were constantly being bombed by the Americans and their sidekick in London, and also the Israelis, because they were implementing the Genocide Convention in the Red Sea, blocking ships from going to Israeli ports. And this is the same Ansarullah that survived 7 years of genocide itself, a genocide where the Saudis and the Emiratis, with the support of Qatar, with the support of Turkey, all of these countries were supporting the genocide in Yemen, along with NATO countries. They were all behind. Ansarullah was very much alone. Only later on, when there was a split between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and we saw that the Saudis and the Emiratis besieged Qatar, Turkey and Qatar move away from Saudi Arabia. But so Yemen, which had survived 7 years of genocide, they were willing to make even more sacrifices for the sake of the people of Gaza. So he gave them special thanks alongside the resistance in Iraq and, of course, the Islamic Republic of Iran. But he also thanked Jordanian citizens who went into, on their own, at their own initiative, not the government had nothing to do with it, into the West Bank and carried out operations against the Israeli regime, and they were all killed and they were all martyred, fighting. There were, I think, 2 or 3 attacks, if I'm not mistaken. Your viewers could correct me if I'm wrong. So if there is a revival, there's no doubt that as we speak, the Iranians continue to support Gaza. They will get new supplies. It's been going on throughout this period through the means that they have, which I have no idea how it works. And the same is happening in Lebanon. The same is happening in Yemen. They're all preparing themselves for the next phase. But it's going to be very costly for the regime if it revives this war. Again, the big, as I said, all the areas that they've withdrawn from in Gaza, the resistance is preparing those territories for the future. So if they want to fight again, they'll have to retake all those territories. And but alongside that, the international community is going to be disgusted because they're saying, well, this is over now. Why are you seeking further trouble? They're releasing your prisoners. And it was very interesting, very smart move by the resistance to have these women, most of these women, wear their uniforms to remind the world that these weren't just a bunch of teenagers or young women that were taken. These were soldiers of the Israeli armed forces. So the Iranians, I think it is a show of force, and we've seen that over the past few weeks, the Iranians have been carrying out extensive maneuvers. It is a show of strength, both to telling the Trump and his people that any mistake in this region would be fatal for the global economy. It would be fatal for the U.S. economy. No one would win. If the Americans could not defeat Ansarullah in the Red Sea after 15, 16 months, then there's not a chance in the world that they're going to be able to defeat the Iranians, especially since the Iranians have been preparing themselves for such a day, for such a possibility for decades. And just today, the Iranians have shown that they have another underground missile base. So the Iranians have these missile bases across the world, across the country, across the Persian Gulf. And I think the Americans recognize that. Israel right now is much more vulnerable than before. And as I said, the world is sick and tired of this genocide. Everyone's people are disgusted, but to restart this genocide after this defeat is going to be much more difficult. And also, since they've withdrawn from Gaza, or most of Gaza right now, it's going to be they're going to go and have to fight. They're going to have to fight again to retake those territories. And in Lebanon, although they never really made any inroads, what they did was that after the ceasefire, they started taking territory. That's how That's how untrustworthy this regime is. So they would go into towns and villages that they'd never been able to take during the war, and they would go in there and start burning down people's homes and the mosques and the shops, and they've been destroying village after village alongside the border. That's how despicable these people are. But people have, as I said, over the last few days, they've used people power and they've pushed them out of most of these territories. If the regime initiates another conflict, it's not going to go well for it. It's going to be much worse than before. And I don't think that it's going to look good for Trump, because Trump was showing this as a sign of his success, in that he was able to bring about a ceasefire before he came in, even before he came into office. And even though he's said the ceasefire may not hold, but it won't look good for him if his allies and if his genocidal allies in Tel Aviv initiated something uh, where the world would see as just another excuse to bring about further genocide. And if the regime does choose to end the ceasefire and begin the genocide again, it's going to be much more difficult, because Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah have been preparing themselves. They've also had a huge morale boost, because people in Gaza have come and seen their power, their capabilities. The world has seen the narrative of the Israeli regime collapse, and Yemen is prepared to fire more missiles. And remember, Iran will ultimately punish, if the fighting goes on. Iran will retaliate against the Israeli regime at some point. There's no doubt about that. I know some people have been saying, why hasn't Iran struck the regime? But as I said before, there were two elements. One was the fact that when Syria fell, and since Syrian airspace became more easily accessible to the Israeli regime, the Iranians had to recalculate how to set up air defenses to make sure the country is protected. And then we had the secret negotiations that were beginning in order to revive the ceasefire after Trump's victory. And the Iranians did not want that to be sabotaged. So during the, I think, 40 days roughly of negotiations, which Iran was deeply involved with, because Iran and Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad and Ansarullah, they're in constant communication with one another. During that period, Iran was cautious not to allow the Israeli regime to have an excuse to refrain from establishing a ceasefire.